Peter Schiff is CEO and Chief Global Strategist for Europe Pacific Capital, Inc. Mr. Schiff began his investment career as a financial consultant with Lehman Brothers after having earned a degree in finance and accounting from UC Berkeley, a financial professional for over 20 years. He joined Europe Pacific in '96 and has served as president since January 2000. He's also contributing commentator for Newsweek International and serves as an economic advisor to the 2008 Ron Paul presidential campaign. Europac.net is the website. Peter, thank you for joining us today.
Well, thanks for having me on, Alex. And just to remind your audience, my show immediately precedes your show on this network now. I'm on for 2 hours a day from 10 to noon on GCN.
Absolutely. Excited to have you as a member of the team. I've heard the show sounds great. Peter, so much to talk about. Bretton Woods 2 going on with Soros today. IMF coming out saying capitalism has failed. But this system of crony capitalism or inside corrupt mega banks getting government to basically make the public pay for their losses, that's not capitalism, is it?
No, not at all. Capitalism works everywhere it's tried. The problem is capitalism is often infected with the disease of socialism or statism. That's what happens. And whenever you mix capitalism with socialism and you create problems, the politicians always blame the problems on capitalism, and they ignore the fact that they were introduced by the socialist legislation that prevented capitalism from working.
That's what's happening, and now we see the Democrats trying to sick the unions and people on other Americans that want to see the budget cut. What's your basic political forecast on where this country currently is and where it's going?
Well, we're in a lot of trouble, and the country is going to get into deeper trouble because we continue to repeat the mistakes that created the problems in the first place. And, when they're trying to couch the argument of cutting back on government spending as somehow being anti-workers, because after all, government workers are going to see their pay cut if we cut back on government. But if we don't do that, then we have to cut the pay of everybody in the private sector because we have to raise their taxes to continue to pay government workers more money than their bosses in the private sector are making. So if you really want to be on the side of the working man, then you've got to be for smaller government because the working man cannot afford the massive government bureaucracy that he's being forced to pay for right now.
Well, if you look at a lot of the super rich at the brokerage houses and mega banks that have gotten, the trillions in bailout money, they're financing the George Soros crowds, the unions on record, to then put out numbers about 5% of the population has half the wealth. And basically the ultra-rich, many of them are trying to sick the uninformed blue-collar folks, some of them, on the middle class, who on average is really paying around 40% in federal income taxes. So do you agree with me that basically you've got a lot of insiders who are ultra-wealthy trying to scapegoat things onto the middle class?
Well, certainly you've got a small segment of the wealthy people who got their wealth through government subsidies or special access granted by government or through the central bank. A lot of Wall Street bankers, financiers are getting rich as the Federal Reserve helps them, bleed the rest of the country. But the vast majority of Americans who have wealth achieved it honestly. They started legitimate businesses. They didn't get special government breaks. In fact, they had to overcome all the obstacles and hurdles that the government put in their path. They are the real heroes. They create the wealth, provide the goods and services, provide the employment opportunities. And it's unfair that they're getting tarred with the same brush. And when you have the central bank doing what they're doing, giving capitalism a bad name, it is stoking the fears of socialism and feeding this class warfare because the average Americans are getting poor. The value of their wages, the value of their savings is being destroyed by the government, by the Federal Reserve. And as they fall further and further behind, they're looking for someone to blame. And when they see in the media these Wall Street tycoons making a fortune, it's very easy for the demagogues to come in and channel that rage and beat the drums for socialism, get the rich, soak the rich, take their money. And then, of course, once you go down that path, there's no turning back because everybody has somebody who's poorer than them who thinks they're rich. And if you have the guy that's making $100,000 a year wants to take money from the guy that's making $1 million a year because he doesn't need all that money and make him pay his fair share, well, to the guy that's making $30,000 a year, the guy that's making $100,000 a year, he's rich and he doesn't need all that money either.
And then meanwhile, we have General Electric, Google, and a handful of other Fortune 100 who help write the loopholes publicly in Congress. They're paying 0 tax or 2% tax or 2.5% tax. And literally, I've studied it, they are the ones financing the big foundations at the universities, teaching the young people that their future is based on wealth redistribution when the mega rich themselves have basically written the rules where they're exempt from this.
And meanwhile, companies like General Electric would have been bankrupt if they didn't get bailed out. And one of the reasons that they don't pay taxes is because all the money that they lost during the financial crisis. But, of course, had they been allowed to go bankrupt, it would be a much different situation. But meanwhile, I own a small company, my company, Europe Pacific Capital. I'm paying about 43% of my corporate income in taxes, because I can't take advantage of all these loopholes. And then whatever my personal income, I'm paying about 45% of what I earn in taxes. And if they raise them much higher, more than half my money is going to be stolen from me by the state and redistributed to other people. How long do they expect me to work if the government's going to take the fruits of my labor? And how long am I going to go on employing people and paying these taxes if I'm turned into a serf?
And for those that don't know, you can look this up. China has much lower corporate income tax. So do most other nations. The United States has, last time I checked, one of the highest corporate income taxes in the world.
It's actually, Alex, the only country that has a higher tax is Japan, but that's not actually true because people forget about the state corporate income taxes. So if you have a corporation in New York or New Jersey or Connecticut or California or Chicago, you're paying an income tax rate well north of 40%. These other countries don't have the local income tax like we do. They just have one income tax. We have two, and sometimes if there's a city income tax, you got three.
Yeah, let me explain that to folks. People say Texas is great because there's no state income tax. But the truth is, in the last 5 years, Texas has passed 3 new business taxes, and they hit companies that start making over $100,000 a year. They have a franchise tax, hospital district taxes, several other taxes that now total federal tax, corporate tax, all the taxes I pay. By the end of it, I've got about 40% to get to my employees and for equipment and things, and then my employees all pay taxes, Peter.
Of course. I mean, I looked at my business, Europe's, my brokerage firm. The U.S. government makes far more money from my brokerage firm than I do. I mean, certainly if you just take a look at the revenues it collects from me in my income tax. But what about the income tax paid by over 100 of my employees that, because of me? And then if you look at all the other fees and licensing fees, and the government is making a fortune off of my business.
Look at your cell phone bill. I mean, how many little taxes do they just add now to that? I mean, it's the water taxes, the trash taxes. There's hundreds of these now. Now, Peter, in the time we've got left, breaking down your prognosis of the economy, it looks like everything you predicted 5 years ago is now happening. The head of Walmart admits, quote, serious inflation is now starting, more and more monetization of debt. I mean, are we now heading into that depression?
Well, yeah, you talk about taxation. Inflation is the most vicious form of taxation because people don't even realize they're paying it. The government is blaming rising prices on speculators, on foreign growth, on Middle East tension. Prices are rising because the government is printing money. Instead of taking money away from us in taxes and spending it, they're robbing our purchasing power. And when your purchasing power is robbed, the way you see that is the price of everything that you need to buy is going up. And this is what is happening. And you mentioned, earlier before you introduced me, that in the month of March, the government spent 8.5 times what it collected in tax revenues. The lion's share of that money was going to repay maturing Treasury debt. And guess how they were able to repay it? By borrowing it from the Federal Reserve, which bought about 70% of those new issues. What is going to happen in a couple of months when the federal government has to borrow all this money and the Federal Reserve's not there? either interest rates have to skyrocket to convince other people to buy, or the Fed's going to have to be back for QE3. But either way, we got big problems ahead.
I wanted to ask that question. Europe, for the first time in decades, led with the announcement, not the Fed, that they're going to go ahead and increase interest rates. The Fed then followed and said maybe at the end of the year. What is it going to do as interest rates rise? Why are they saying that's triggering further dollar devaluation?
Well, A, they're not rising fast enough, because just raising interest rates by a quarter point here and a quarter point there ain't going to do it. You're still behind the curve. The Fed has to get aggressive to fight inflation, but the problem is it can't get aggressive because the entire phony recovery that we have going is built on a foundation of cheap money and cheap credit. And if you take that foundation away, the whole thing will implode. So the Fed is in a box that if it wants to pretend the economy is growing, it has to keep rates down and let inflation run out of control. All it can do is lie about it, pretend it doesn't exist, and then when it shows up, blame it on somebody else.
So what's the time frame here? I mean, you predicted the collapse of the Fannie and Freddie. You predicted what happened in October of 2008. What's on the horizon, and what's right down the street, and what's standing right in front of us?
Well, I don't know exactly how much time we have. I think you can measure it just a few short years, and it might not even be that much time. It might be 6 months. I think a much greater financial crisis is coming. What we had in 2008 was the overture. The opera has only just begun, and the reason it's going to be so bad is because of all the things the government did to save us from the pain. They didn't save us from the pain. They postponed it, but made it much worse. And I think, you mentioned earlier about, Nothouse and how the government is, trying to turn what he did into a counterfeiting or an act of terrorism. If you look at what the government is doing, they are laying the foundation for making it illegal to buy gold and silver or sell gold and silver, because what they said was that Nothouse was a terrorist. And what did he do? Right? He didn't counterfeit U.S. currency. He created an alternative. He tried to advocate using his Liberty dollars instead of using U.S. dollars. He wasn't trying to confuse people over what they were. He didn't try to create them so that he could pass them off pretending they were legitimate U.S. currency. His plan, he was saying U.S. currency is no good. It's going to get inflated away. So hold on to this instead. And what the government says is that act, the act of offering an alternative to the dollar, makes you a terrorist. Well, if he's a terrorist, I'm a terrorist. I got a precious metals company, Euro Pacific Precious Metals. I recommend that people buy gold and silver. I sell gold and silver. In my most recent newsletter, I recommended using gold and silver as a form of barter. And so am I undermining the U.S. monetary system?
No, the globalists, by devaluing the dollar, by monetizing debt, they're the ones that are doing it. And so now they're scared of alternatives that publicly challenge them. And it's a very dangerous precedent.
Absolutely. The one who's undermining our monetary system is Ben Bernanke. It's Congress. They're debasing the money. But what the government doesn't want is Americans to have an escape valve. They don't want Americans to have an alternative. They want to keep us bottled in that currency so they can keep stealing its value. And this shows you it's the camel's nose under the tent. First they go after this guy, and then they expand it, and eventually it's illegal to own it. You can't, because if somebody owns gold, they're undermining our monetary system. After all, they could have been saving in dollars. I'm telling people to buy gold, not to save dollars. Well, I'm undermining our monetary system. Well, the problem is it's already been undermined. I understand that, so I'm trying to get Americans to understand that if they don't want to be broke, that they need to save something of real intrinsic value. Yeah. And the government doesn't want anybody doing that.
Well, it's really simple. You've come out with a car and we've come out with a car that works better, has high quality. We're telling people that a certain dealership has a record of selling cars that break down when you drive them off the lot, and the car dealership has sent police to basically try to arrest us. I mean, that's really what it comes down to. They don't want reality of precious metals getting in the way of their fraudulent system.
Meanwhile, gold's at an all-time record high today. Finally, silver's at a new 31-year high. And it's not like that we're trying to make cars and pass them off as these lousy cars that the government is making. We are basically saying, no, the government's car is no good. Buy this one instead. Counterfeiting is when if somebody counterfeits a $100 bill, they make it look exactly like a $100 bill, and they go and spend it, and they hope the person thinks it's a legitimate $100 bill, a legal U.S. tender. That is not what anybody who is advocating gold and silver ownership is doing. In fact, they're specifically stating that money is no good. and get rid
absolutely.
of it as fast as you
Peter
can.
Schiff, stay there. Final segment coming up. We'll look more at the economy straight ahead with Peter Schiff. I'm Alex Jones, InfoWars.com.
Like an angel.
So the private Federal Reserve teamed up with the government, has basically destroyed the dollar, devalued it. They're monetizing 70% of the debt. That means Weimar Republic, Zimbabwe, Argentina. And if you go back to 1933, they do not want to compete with gold and silver. And as gold and silver continues its meteoric rise, they have been trying to demonize it. They've been trying to manipulate the market. They're now failing against the laws of economics. And we are just steamrolling into this crisis. The very banksters that engineered this are now going to pose as our saviors and try to bring in even more controlled economies as the answer, which never works. It works for them, not for the general public. Peter, how do we defeat these people?
Well, ultimately, they're going to defeat themselves because the whole economy is going to collapse around them. We have to make sure that they get the blame for it, that central banking and central government planning gets the blame. All we've had is repeated doses of government stimulus. The stimulus is the problem. The stimulus is toxic. That's why the country is so sick. And we're not going to solve our problems with government stimulus. We can't solve them until the government stops stimulating. The problem is they never will, because they don't have the political courage to take away the punch bowl. Because in order to get better, we have to swallow some bitter-tasting medicine. We have to recognize that our economy is all screwed up. We got too many people working for government, too many people working in the service sector, not enough people manufacturing and producing. We got too many regulations. We got too much rules. We don't have enough savings. A lot of things have to change. And during that transition, you know, there's going to be winners and losers. And the politicians don't want that, because a lot of the losers are the ones that are voting these politicians into office. So they're just going to continue to pretend that they can make everything better with a magic wand, that all we need is to print some more money, to have some more spending and more stimulus, and we'll solve these problems. We're going to overdose on government stimulus. They're going to kill this economy. And we're witnessing the beginnings of it right now. I mean, gold wouldn't be up $19 an ounce. Silver wouldn't be up almost 70 cents today if what they were doing was working.
Now, are you concerned about this government shutdown, the Democrats trying to hold people hostage if they don't increase spending?
Now, I'm concerned that it won't shut down. I mean, a government shutdown is the best thing that could happen to us, because if the government doesn't shut down, then the country's going to shut down. The only way to save the country is to shut down the government and force spending cuts. I mean, we have a $1.6 trillion budget deficit for this year, and these clowns are arguing over whether we should cut that by $30 billion or $60 billion. That's peanuts. I mean, that's not going to do anything. The Republicans need to argue for real, meaningful cuts in government spending, because now, even if they get what they want, it's meaningless. The whole economy is still going to collapse.
Exactly. If we don't say no to the too big to fail derivatives model, then everything else is just academic. But expanding finally on that, to be clear about my point, just like in October of 2008, the Treasury and Fed held the country hostage, talked down the economy to cause that huge plunge to then get their bailout. I'm saying they're going to try to use a government shutdown as a way to hold us hostage to go along with the expanding debt.
Well, they're not going to shut the government down. They're going to make a lot of noise, and at the end of the day, they're going to raise the debt ceiling yet again, and they're going to spend more money because they can do it. And as long as the Chinese are lending to us, and the Japanese and the Saudis, we're going to keep borrowing. And as long as Ben Bernanke is printing, we're going to keep spending, and then until the whole thing falls off the edge of a cliff. And nobody wants to acknowledge that what we need to do is raise interest rates, tighten up on credit, because nobody wants to go through the fact that, well, that's going to bring down the stock market. That's going to cause housing prices to fall. They have to fall. Housing prices are too high. And the consequence of trying to artificially prop them up with cheap credit is that we destroy the currency, and we inflict far greater damage and far greater losses across the country than if we simply let housing prices fall to their natural level.
Well, bottom line, we're in a battle to get the truth out, because if we don't, the system's going to use these crises to expand their model of vertical integration with the mega corporations teamed up with government. Peter Schiff, thank you so much for joining us. Look forward to speaking to you in the near future.
Thanks for having me on.
You bet. We'll be right back.